Okay, great. So, what are we here today? Bioplastics. Can bioplastics save the world? I don't know. It's a question, and that's what we're going to try to answer. And one of the things that this talk and this topic really is a starting point for a conversation. So I really want you guys to be thinking critically, and I don't know all the answers. I just dove into this topic to present it this year for people because it was something of interest to me. And it turns out that a lot of what I needed was some disambiguation about what this means, right? So bioplastics, and what I'm going to be talking about is bio-based and compostable plastics. All right. So what does that really even mean now? Now, bioplastics, it's really talks about both plastics that come from bio-based origins, such as plants or other or bacteria or something that's biologically sourced, or something that is biodegradable. It could come from fossil sources, but it's biodegradable. And ideally, it's both of those, right? And so a lot of they talk about this is this, if you can see it right here, this kind of quadrant here, this, I guess, 4-quadrant plate axis. And yeah, the ideal is both biodegradable and bio-based, but some things are non-biodegradable, but they're bio-based. And some things down here are biodegradable and fossil-based. And some things are just conventional plastics, things that you're used to. Now, this slide has got a lot of information on it, and it's basically, there's going to be a lot of terms I'm going to be using. I'm going to be saying like polypropylene or PP. I'm going to say PET or polyethylene. A lot of these things are PLA, polylactic acid. Those are going to come up a lot. And a lot of times, I even don't remember what PLA stands for, polylactic acid. I mean, that's not the first thing that comes to mind. So what we're going to say is I'm going to use a lot of these terms. And if you want to just become familiar with them, go for it. I'll be able to explain a lot, but these are just a lot of the terms that we have. But what does that really even mean, right? When I say PLA or PP or PET, right? They all describe plastics that we see every day, right? So this here is a really great description that shows when we're talking about PET, this is what we're talking about. All of these plastic bottles and things that you have, you can, plastic bottles. I don't have any plastic bottles around me. As an example, and you have high density polyethylene or HDPE. A lot of the stuff you have under your sink is going to be high density polyethylene, and low density polyethylene as well. It's one of those things. Polyvinyl chloride or PVC is in a lot of pipes. Polypropylene is a lot of durable goods. Polystyrene is your styrofoam cups and some other plastic cups. And actually, those old CD cases, those are polystyrene. Is why they kind of broke so readily compared to some other plastics. But this is the main distribution of the plastics that are, we have the applications for plastics and what we talk about. Now, on the other category, we're going to be talking a lot about some like PLA and some other plastics that are more bio-based or biodegradable, and those will fit in the other category. But this is just kind of a snapshot for some of the more conventional plastics and what those numbers, those random string of letters, what they really mean, not just the chemical formula, but really a product that you've seen in your hand, right? So, and on the back of a lot of the products, you'll see like a recycle code. Not this one, but underneath here, there'll be a recycle code, and maybe it'll say what it is, what the actual product is down there. So you can actually see like PP or HDPE under there, and you'll be able to, I guess, be familiar with what the plastic feels like and looks like and what its actual chemical name is. So if you decide you want to learn that. But getting on to bioplastics, what is, I guess, this ideal life cycle of bioplastics, right? So this is something that when you think about bioplastics, you think about this life cycle. And in reality, when you think about plastics and in general, most consumer goods, you want to think about a life cycle of it, because that's the end of use cycle is really going to be important for what you do with the dispose of it. You don't just have to make it, you have to dispose of it, and how that whole cycle works. So a life cycle like this is kind of ideal, where you have these raw materials that are grown from the ground, then they're harvested and extracted some of the molecules that we need. These molecules are rough and we need to form them into such a way that we have refining. And then you move into these refined materials, which then can be put in these manufacturing, just like conventional plastics. The manufacturing can then be processed, and then we dispose of them. We dispose them in a biodegradable manner, and that those materials will then break down into the basic components, in which then can be composted. Those nutrients and carbon can go right back into the environment, and then produce the carbon can go right back into raw materials again, and thus the cycle moves around. And this is kind of the ideal cycle, but it's actually a little more complicated than that when you come down to the whole scope of bioplastics. Now, where's my mouse? There we are. Okay. So the real, like the better perspective on bioplastics, this is a more complete perspective on bioplastics. And this was adapted from a paper on green and current opinions on green and sustainable chemistry. And I'm just going to point out that some of these 13, 8, 11, these are some sustainability goals that are like these global sustainability goals that are talked a lot about inside of these papers. I'm not going to go into it, but in case anyone's curious what those numbers are, they're things that target these sustainability goals. So I would encourage you to go and read up on those if you're really interested in sustainability and where people have set our goals for and what different areas require attention. And these numbers and those graphics, they'll just kind of point out that a circular economy with bioplastics really hits a lot of sustainability goals for the future. So let's start up here at the nexus of consumer use, right? So we've got a plastic good, right? It's a plastic good. Now, this plastic good could be just simply recycled, right? You put it back into the recycling, it gets processed, it's mechanically broken up into pieces, and then the granulates will go, and someone's drawing, Ambar is drawing. Do you have something to say?
Stupid finger movements, apologize, sorry.
Oh, it's all good, all good. I didn't know if there was something really important I had to see. I was like, what's going on here? Yes, so we'll see here, these are just ground up, and like mainly like thermoplastics can then just be melted down and put right back into the machines and made into more consumer goods. Now, it's a little more complicated than just that, and we'll get into recycling later, but that's I guess the simplest and the ideal of recycling. Now, there's some things that can go into a composting, but and they're not just mechanically recycled, but they're more chemically recycled. So some material needs to be broken down through chemical means, or biochemical means through biorefinery, and then they can extract the high value chemicals, whether it's broken down in a special bioreactor, some anaerobic digestion, or composting. They'll all be broken down into their either high value chemicals or in some ways into their monomers, and then once they're into it can be grown again and then put back into these monomers, which then can be chemically processed into that starting material and then put back into the bioplastics. So as you see, there's a lot of different routes based on what materials you want to use, material properties you need, and what materials you're starting with, and even what resources are available to you. So one of the keys to this is really the composting, because that's the ideal. That's that large goal there for that original picture that I showed you. But not all composting is the same. And when I was studying this material, I found that composting was a very interesting topic. And I think that I could have given an entire talk on just composting, and it would have been pretty interesting. Maybe in the future we'll do talk entirely on composting, but putting it in this context I think is really important. So what is the difference between the composting you can do at home, right? We just take your food scraps and you put them in the backyard and you turn them over once or twice, and you'll be able to put them back into your garden. Now that's simple composting, but not everything can get put into that compost, right? So you can see here, this is a commercial compost, what you can put, and I guess you can't put in the commercial compost, right? So they're showing that this year, these food scraps are what you can put into your compost at home, but you can't put the greasy meat or fish or dairy or bones or anything in your home compost. You need to put them in the commercial compost. And the soiled paper and boxes and all this other stuff, you can't put in your compost at home. You can put yard waste, and I think you can put coffee grounds, but the rest need to be done in the industrial composting. Now, this year, another quadrant shows kind of the the industrial composting, and a little summary of what the difference between it is. So one of them is it gets a lot hotter in those industrial compost sections, and another thing that they do is they grind everything up into these smaller granules. Now, if you remember your freshman chemistry teacher, sophomore chem teacher saying that, small things react faster because they just have more collisions, make more reactions, and thus you can get the reaction to go through faster. So that's exactly the same thing here. There's no mystery to it. It's just physically there's better interaction between the surface interaction of these molecules. There's a lot more surface area. You can have the enzymes and bacteria break down much faster. And also you can see it gets hotter to allow certain reactions to happen, and there's thermophilic digestion, certain enzymes and microbes to work at that higher temperature. And they do this by turning over more frequently, but also pumping air in to be able to give more air for the reactions to just happen. So these are some of the, differences between the industrial and the home composting. Now, one question came up when I first gave this talk, and it was, why can't we do this at home, right? Why can't we have those same features? And you can. There are certain people that are building home composters that can do this stuff, that can actually, you have to be more active, you have to pump the air in, you have to have chippers and grinders. A lot of people like to have their home compost be a very passive hobby rather than something that's more active, and that's what you need to do for this industrial composting. But you could simulate these things at home and get the same results. Maybe you'll need a certain size pile and maybe some proprietary enzymes or microbes that produce some enzymes into these things. But yeah, there's a lot out there. So if you're really interested in going deep into compost, I definitely would recommend looking into that, and you can learn a lot about it. And maybe you can have a project where you can build one of these industrial style composting home. Who knows? That might be a fun little boss lab project, right? A little engineering aspect. So on the one hand, we talked about over here, we had talked about this composting, but then we have this mechanical recycling. So I wanted to talk a little bit about mechanical recycling. Now, Waste Management is one of the larger waste disposal and recycling companies in the country. They have 21 million residencies. So they put this infographic together about it. So I'm just going to go through a little briefly and talk about recycling. And once again, recycling, we could have done a whole talk on just recycling, but it's important to, understand the context of where all this stuff comes from and and where to place it all. So how single stream recycling works is the trucks come in and they have all the stuff together in one big bin, and sorters will remove certain things that shouldn't be there at all, right? Like, sticks and things that are really not recyclable or never going to be recyclable, or rocks or certain things that are way too obviously, and they can dirty, and they'll get rid of them. And the first thing you do is take off the cardboard boxes and recycle those. And then they use these big fans to try to remove papers and things like that, to blow them away and to recycle them from the heavier objects. And there's something called a paper magnet, which I don't know the physics of that, but it sounds pretty interesting. I guess it's just vacuums, but still, it's pretty interesting to have these big vacuums or fans pulling the papers away. And then you'll remove the steel and then the glass. And the glass gets sorted with like the whole bottles get sorted away, but broken bottles actually cause more of a problem for the glass. And with some of the broken glass doesn't get recycled quite as well. So it's one thing to notice when you put in the glass in, maybe be more gentle with it. And then then you get to the plastic. Now the plastic will scan, these optical scanners that'll sort some of the paper and try to sort some of the plastics, because the plastics really need to be sorted a lot. And there's many different types of plastics that go into the recycling. And some plastics can get recycled directly back into the same materials they have. I think PET is one of those materials that is more readily recycled. There's some other materials which they downcycle them. They have to make them into maybe products that have a lower quality standard for them. One thing that you'll notice in some park benches feel really plasticky because they're made out of this post-consumer recycled plastic. You can also buy, I think, these boards at Lowe's or whatever for your deck. You can make them out of this plastic material, post-consumer plastic material, because there's a little different standard than you'd want in a water bottle. So that gives a little overview of the environment for which we're going to put these bioplastics in. And now let me talk a little bit about some of the particular bioplastics. Are there any questions on the composting or the recycling, or just generally on the materials that we're talking about before I move on to some specific examples?
John, I had a quick question. So out of the mechanical, chemical, and organic recycling, what's the most used stream what's the highest percentage of the way we recycle plastic?
I mean, I think it's just straight mechanical recycling right now. I think some of the other stuff is more of what happens when they for some of these biomaterials. So, but don't quote me on that.
Okay.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about some of these materials, because in the concept of bioplastics, there's a bunch of different takes on it, right? So this is polylactic acid, or PLA. Now, PLA is one of the more commonly found bioplastic materials. You'll find them in certain cups. Like if you go to Clover and you get yourself a coffee, right there, it says it's biodegradable, but at this facility, because these things are industrial biodegradable, not at home biodegradable. These are that ideal where they're derived from starches made from corn or sugarcane or some other kava or beet, other materials. They'll take the starches out and they will process those monomer starches into the PLA. And then this life cycle here shows how you get this glucose goes into the lactate and then goes to the polylactic acid, which then through the biodegradation goes back into carbon dioxide. You'll see this life cycle. So this PLA does fit into that ideal biomaterials. And one of the applications, which you maybe don't even notice about it, is in certain coffee cups. I don't have one anymore. The lining on the inside will be a thin layer of PLA, so it's a lot more watertight, and you don't get coffee all over your hands for holding it for too long. So some other materials, PHAs, right, are polyhydroxyl alkanates. These are some interesting PHAs because you can make them inside of microbes or inside of algae. So you take like sugars, like corn sugars fed into commercial fermenters, and where these microbes that are purposely designed to make them, this isn't something we found in nature, but we program these microbes to be able to make PHA or PHB granules in the bacteria. And you'll find these things in the dog bags, right? Your doggy waste bags that are biodegradable. And even in these Target gift cards, certain gift cards, you want them to be sort of durable, but you also want them to be single use. So having them biodegradable is a good idea. So this is an example of plastics that are made through microbial fermentation or some other microbial produced bioplastics.
John, Stefan wants to know,
Yes.
Wouldn't it be better to keep the CO2 fixated in the bioplastic?
What do you mean by that? Like what CO2?
On the surface, it seems great. It's fully degraded, so the CO2 is released, but we know what the problem is with that. Wouldn't it be better we keep it in a material that we can bury, so the CO2 is out of the atmosphere forever?
There's a couple thoughts on this. One, the CO2 in this particular example and this life cycle, the CO2 is the atmosphere is the immediate source in the last few years and the sink for the carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide, it's in a relative time scale. It's kind of a carbon neutral system. And yes, I guess sequestering carbon is a good option, but I think also having plastic waste just sitting there isn't always the best option for that. Now, when we talk about bio-based plastics, which we will in a little bit, I'll just give you a little preview about them. So actually, let's talk about it right now, right? Why not? Let's get there. Let's talk about bio-PET. So bio-PET, Coca-Cola launched this bio-PET bottle where they're having a fully recyclable bottle that's made out of plant materials, but it goes right into the same PET that you would have from something that was made from a fossil fuel. And so in that regard, you're taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and you're putting it into this cycle of recyclable materials, and it's being kind of sequestered in the whole recycling system right here. So you are doing that, and that is a kind of a sequestering, but you're also producing plastics that aren't biodegradable, that in a couple of years they're not going to be gone. They're still going to be here, and we still have to deal with them being around for permanently. So I guess the balance is, do we sequester the carbon in carbon dioxide, or do we try to put it somewhere permanently? And I don't know what's better, right? I think having both options right now is great, and working on both of them. I have a tendency to think that this cycle of just have minimal final impact, good or bad, but have the product, have the consumer use, I think is something that is exciting to me. And as I said earlier, this is a conversation. This is something that I don't know. I'm not an expert on this. I just read about it, and I'm interested in it. It's really exciting, and there's a lot to learn, a lot to do, and there's a lot to actually invent to have a successful future. But on that note, let's talk about polyethylene after the bio-PET project. And by the way, the bio-PET bottles that they're trying to produce, Coca-Cola is trying to move to 100% bio derived plastics for their bottles, which I think is kind of a cool initiative, having this plant bottle. But once again, I probably would have been more excited about something that went completely back to the way it started, rather than something that just gets sequestered into the recycling system. This is actually pretty cool, because the processing for biopolyethylene, I found this graphic that shows that 1 hectare of land, which isn't a lot, I guess they show a soccer field. By the way, a lot of the bioplastics is pioneered over in Europe. So a lot of the statistics and figures and facts I get are from some European lifestyle rather than just here in America. So, which is, I guess, why they use the soccer pitch rather than a football field, right, for their example of what a hectare is. Will produce 8.2 tons of sugarcane, and goes to about 3 tons of green polyethylene, right? But once you get here to ethanol, right, it's identical. So it isn't bio anything anymore. It's just ethanol, because it's chemically identical. And then it goes to ethylene, and then into polyethylene, and it's exactly the same. You can they refer to this as a drop-in replacement for recycling. Yeah, drop-in replacement right here. That's why I said it. And so that's one of the, I guess, the cool things. We don't need to be using these fossil resources anymore for this, because the reality is carbon dioxide is a problem, but there's also a limited supply of oil, and it's increasingly difficult to extract that oil as it gets lower and lower pressures from these oil fields. And not to mention there's an ecological devastation every time you're drilling these new oil fields, and there's a lot of problems with the oil, even though it's, forgetting about the carbon dioxide, there's a lot of other problems with fossil fuels, which is, I guess, why some of us got in this industry to begin with, right? Try to solve that problem. Back to Wendy's favorite example, and I guess my favorite example as well. These TPS cellulose acetate and starch blends. So these thermoplastic starches you take the starches, these polymers of starches from the material, corn or potato or whatever, and you can break them down into there's just the starch components, and just extract the starches, and you can utilize those as a feedstock for these particular plastics. And you'll notice the feel and quality of them are quite unique. They're effective, But you can tell they're a little weaker than some of the plastics, but the point is they're single use. So that's great for those, right? Interesting thing about cellulose is cellulose was utilized in clothing, right? So, it was 1865, a French chemist, Paul Schutzenbecker, discovered that cellulose reacts with acetic anhydride to form cellulose acetate. And it was used as a biopolymer incorporated into garments. But it degrades in the dryer, which is why you needed to be very careful with how you use them. But that material is kind of phased out for rayon, which is not quite biodegradable and not quite as bio-based, but it does have some easier properties and feels similar to rayon. So kind of an interesting, one of the earlier uses of biomaterials. So these are some of the ones that are more obvious to use. And the fact they feel quite different than the traditional plastics, I think it makes them more readily identified as something that's compostable. Actually, are there any questions on some of these examples of the current usage for biomaterials?
Would I know when I buy some stuff in the supermarket, do I, as a average consumer, have a clue whether I have something it's a bioplastic in my hand when I shop, or not?
Yeah,
really?
It'll be more expensive. I guess. Okay. I don't know. So you're actually hitting on to something that came up in a lot of the discussions and interviews and things that I was, when I was doing my research for this particular talk. So one of the conversations that was happening in that space was about how we educate consumers to what to do with the materials, because if they have these biomaterials, if we say you are a vendor that is moving over all biomaterials and you're putting them out on the shelves and you're trying to keep the prices down for your patrons, and they go and they take these materials and dispose of them improperly, then all of that work, maybe extra money and effort is gone to waste. So we need to be able to educate the consumer on how to properly dispose in this end of life cycle, the beginning of this was the end of life cycles, how to properly utilize those, how to properly recycle or degrade or put them in the proper waste streams in order to use the material properties that are built into the consumer goods that we buy. So I guess to answer your question, I really hope that the vendor is informing you in an effective way. But what is the most effective way? That's something that we, I guess, as an industry, they need to figure out a good way to communicate what those things are, and good way to educate the general public on how to do it, right? And we've learned how to recycle as a community, but this is, I guess, the next step. Did that answer your question?
John, I had a quick question. So let's take this example of using these starch-based plastics. You know what the cost differential is? Like, let's say I'm going to make a fork the old way versus using this material now. Is it log units different, or you might not know that, but
I truly do not know that. I don't really know, but I do know that they're not the most like traditional plastics are far outweigh the use of these materials. But when you're talking about commodity chemicals and prices and things like that for consumer goods, a very small change in price can have a big impact on the movement of what people use. So I don't really know how that's, I guess, affecting that. I'd be really interested to know, what the breakdown is. But a lot of the stuff, I guess, doesn't cover that. It probably varies too. Maybe we'll look into that for the next, if I ever give this talk again, right? So one thing I want to do is look to the future.
Companies in this space? Companies?
Yes,
is it like big chemical companies, or is it like big egg processing companies like ADM? I'm just curious.
The primary manufacturer of PLA is NatureWorks LLC. NatureWorks is wholly owned subsidiary of Cargill, and they make it under the brand name Inego, and their facilities in Blair, Nebraska produces 300 million pounds of Inego resins per year. I forget this one here. I think I took the name of this out in my notes, but there was another company from Indiana that made Mirel, which the cellulose, and it's also an American company. And third major group of bioplastics. So I have some good resources that I can point you to which have some of these larger companies in it. And I can, if you want to follow up a little later, I can get you some of those things. So yeah, I mean, I don't see like Dow Chemical or any of those people in these conversations that I've had in these papers that I've been reading, but I'm not really sure about what the larger companies are doing or investing into this stuff. So, but I'll bet you if it becomes profitable, those larger companies are going to want to buy it anyway. So that's what you do, right? Moving on, looking towards the future, marine degradable plastics. Now, the PHA actually does pass some marine degradable tests, but in general, as we showed before, bioplastics need to be in certain environments in order for them to most efficiently degrade, right? They can't just be sitting on the side of the road or in your compost, your backyard, or in your fridge. They're not going to degrade. And in the ocean, they don't have that ideal environment either, right? So what happens is this bioplastics doesn't, just because it goes to the ocean doesn't mean it's going to degrade. But there's one group that had come up with a marine degradable polymer, right? So they took the PLA, right? The regular PLA life cycle. The PLA, we saw this before. We're using, just reusing some of these. They took this polylactic acid structure and they co-polymerized it with this DOX molecule, and was able to add on a piece here that's, I guess, going to break down first, and it's going to show some degradation in the marine environment. So they kind of gave a handle for the degradation to start. And so as you can see, over the course of 45 days, the regular PLA doesn't break down in the marine environment, but this new copolymer PLA does start to break down. So this shows that, you know, we can't just dump these bioplastics in the environment as they are, or these biodegradable plastics in the environment as they are. We really need to start thinking about certain environmental conditions for breakdown and making sure that things break down in those conditions as well. And I guess any of you have seen this talk, or anybody you know me, know that we're not going to get out of something like this without talking about algae. So algae, right? You can make plastic precursors from algae, and algae are great because they eat sunlight. While in some of the other ones, you have to grow these fields of like sugarcane and feed them to the bacteria to grow. With algae, you just give them some space and some light and some carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they're going to do the thing and make biomass, right? So it kind of saves you a step. This slide is not a great slide for presentation. I'm going to admit that right now. I was really excited to find this in a talk, and it kind of shows a little bit about the metabolism. And it shows that a lot of these squares are precursors for making certain commodity chemicals. And these precursors they come off of the core pathway of your algae metabolic pathway. So you can tune up or tune down your favorite algae of choice in order to make some of these things. And this is kind of one of the exciting things about the algae. And you'll see here you have some of my favorite, right? You have Synechococcus elongatus, you have a Synechocistus PCC 6803, and you'll have Synechococcus 7002. Some of these are model organisms, and that we know so much about their metabolism, and we've done so much microbiology on these organisms that we can really more easily, we have more tools and more easily do some changes to their metabolism to focus them on making some of these commodity chemicals that we want. And you see here, this is right here, you'll see the actual granules in the cyanobacteria that actually have the PHB consolidated in them. And this is done in an interesting way where you'll grow the algae, and they call it they grow the green algae in the sunlight, right? In a phototrophic phase where they're growing up and they're getting lots of sunlight, and they're moving and they're expanding their numbers as much as possible. And then they go into this yellow stage, this dark stage, where they're kind of autotrophic or autoheterotrophic, and you'll find some algae that's able to switch over to a second metabolism where there's no sunlight. And that second metabolism is that we're going to make and store a lot of these chemicals. You play around with the switches inside of their genome, and they're going to move their stored energy into this storage material. And that sort of material is what you want to then take out, right? And then you take about 10% back and you put it in, and then inoculates a new growth where you have your 5 to 6 days, or depending on your organism, will change, and your temperatures, be able to restart the culture, and just the cycle keep going over and over again. That 90% that you put out, you'll then extract out the chemicals you want. And to answer your question before, it's not going to be 100% of the biomass. You're going to have a lot of carbon that's in just question of this algae, which you then can bury, and then 100,000 years to dig up oil, whatever you do with the algae. You can use the algae for maybe fertilizers. You can use the algae for animal feed, or there's a lot of things you can do with those algae husks or whatever to put it back in the cycle. But once again, you're pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and you're putting it into these chemicals. So I just really like that idea, that concept. And I guess kind of to wind down, where do we use bioplastics? Because I'm speaking to you guys, and your guys are like the next generation of innovators. So where do we need to start innovating? What do we have, and what are we using, and where can we focus? So you'll see that production of bioplastics is these rigid packaging is the highest single use of this bioplastics, right? And you'll see a lot of them are biopolyethylene, but where's room to grow, right? And you'll see that here of production of bioplastics, right? So your PLA and your polyesters are larger individual chunks of the biodegradable plastics. But there's a lot more of the bio-based and non-biodegradable plastics. This bio-PET right here, this doesn't degrade. So you're still left with some of this plastic waste to try to figure out what to do with, right? So ideally, I'd love to see this red area grow, right? And over here, I think you see these PLAs and everything grow. And polyethylene is great, but once you make it, you still have the same problem. This plastic's just sitting around. You have to do something with it. And then I guess finally, in conclusion, just another snapshot. Two really important things I want to show you is how the bioplastics market is looking to grow. So there's a lot that could be done in the future with bioplastics, right? So as things are growing, it's gonna increase tenfold and tenfold. And focusing a lot of time and energy into bioplastics is really going to be important for the future. Likewise, focusing some time, energy, and donations into Boss Lab is going to be important for the future. So here is our donor box. If you really like what you saw, you want to support more community programming like this, you can donate as you like. I guess, are there any more questions or comments or criticisms?
Don, I had a question. So that slide before the end, when you were talking about percentage in production, most of the stats, this one, yeah, all from European sources. Is that because they're leaders in this field? Is the U.S. a player, or who's really leading the field in producing?
I don't want to say that Europe is leading the field, but I would say that it is highly likely that if I'm reading a paper on bioplastics, it comes from a European group. I don't know what that correlation is based on, whether they have the most resources focused, maybe their governments are funding it better, maybe it's more an interest inside of their communities, maybe it's one group of related labs that all care about it a lot. I don't know, but it appears to be that Europe is definitely thinking about this a lot more than other regions.
Makes me think that we're pretty sold on our fossil fuels here, right? They're pretty entrenched in our economy. So
I will say that in Europe, all the sustainable research is, I think, much bigger. I think it's also much more likely that there's going to be a CO2 tax European-wide over there. So that's maybe why already a lot of companies are preparing. And how can we reduce our impact?
I mean, it also could just be we don't have a program manager at the NSF that cares about it. There's a really funding for research for this is consolidated into a rather small group of individuals that decide the entire push for research. So it might just be that the people that have the purse strings don't care about this right now. And it might not be the country at large that decides these things. It could just be the people that are causing those, they're running that right then. Or, yeah, who knows? But there's a lot of factors that can be as to why a place cares about it or not. But
so John, what are the objections to bioplastics? You said the small group doesn't want it. So they must be giving some reason or some thought, or maybe something else they consider better option.
I mean, there's so many things that are important in this world. I mean, how do you pick what's most important? Is bioplastics the most important thing to you of all the things you can think of to put money? If you had $1 to give to a research thrust, would it be bioplastics? I mean, I don't know. And that's what I meant by you might not particularly bad because they might just care about other things more. But I think one objection to bioplastics could be going back to the beginning, where bioplastics is somewhat of an ambiguous term for this whole field, right? And a lot of the things in this quadrant number 2 and quadrant number 4, they don't go far enough, and some of the material properties in quadrant number 1 just aren't ideal, and consumers don't want those. So you could be like, oh, it doesn't work now. Why are we focusing on it? Is it ever going to work? So that kind of thought it happens, right? So
yeah, I mean, that could be just like, the scaling issue. Like, it may be very expensive now, as you said, to one of the answers, but in scale, it might become more affordable and more easy to use. So is this a typical reaction, or is there something else technologically they're saying, maybe this is not a superior solution, or it's just a matter of politics?
Oh, I mean, I think, I know very little about the politics involved in this. I have as much suspicion as you do about all these people at play. But if you just look from the most basic and non-science perspective, right? This polycarbonate bottle is really good, works really well, right? And you have another bag, right, that's made out of a biodegradable bag, and it rips more frequently than the bag that's not biodegradable. And the one that isn't biodegradable says it's recyclable, so isn't that good enough? Even though most recycling, I don't know, Somerville, Massachusetts recycling doesn't take plastic bags, and a lot of places don't take plastic bags, so they're not really recyclable at home, and styrofoam's not really recyclable. So getting people to realize that the simple solutions aren't quite so simple, and that maybe some of these other alternatives are a compromise in the user experience of them is worthwhile in the long-term effects of them, right? Personally, I would much rather have my hand get a little hot when I'm drinking a cup of coffee than to use a styrofoam cup that's never going anywhere. It's not going to biodegrade. It's not going to get recycled. It's just going to stick around forever, So that trade-off is fine for me. I think on the consumer level, understanding these biopolymers currently at the state they're in, the material properties don't have the same benefits that some of the less, I guess, the things that are more environmentally costly, those feel nicer, and we're used to those things. So politics aside, consumers who aren't thinking about this entire construct of this global environmental energy system, all they know is that one is a lot nicer for them to use than the other, right?
So you're saying it's also a factor of awareness, right? So it's not made typical consumer is not as aware of the long-term consequences of what bioplastics can bring or do for them. Yeah,
exactly. And seatbelts, right? Who wants to use a seatbelt when they're driving? It's uncomfortable. You can't move around anymore. You can't reach all the way down in the corner to get the bottle, your plastic bottle that rolled over. What's the point of these seatbelts, right? But they have a really good purpose and use. So consumers just have to get used to using them. And there's still people who hate seatbelts. I don't know why, but so there's so much to it. And yeah, I believe that there are some scientists out there that are, and engineers that are going to be developing bioplastics that are far superior than anything that we have right now. And it's going to be kind of silly that we ever had something that wasn't, didn't have a complete life cycle, that was on a short time scale, a very short time scale, complete life cycle. That's the ideal. And maybe it's downstream processing. Maybe we have a super recycler invention that's coming up that's going to be able to take these materials and so quickly recycle them. I don't know. So that's what you guys are here for. I'm here to talk to you about what the problems are, and you guys are there to go to the future and fix them.
That's right.
Right.
So are there startups in this space and investors who fund startups as far as you have seen? And if yes, what are they? What are the startups working on?
I don't know, actually. I did not come across like startups in the, I guess, in the sense that like you see with a lot of other industries. Doesn't mean they're not there, but it just didn't come across my desk. Like I said, I'm not claiming to be an expert on this. I'm claiming to be an enthusiast that thought it was cool, and I just read a bunch of papers and skimmed a bunch more and stole some graphics online and made presentations. So there could be a lot out there that I missed. And some of these questions really bring up great topics I'd love to do. I never thought about what the startup spaces are. I feel like I should have looked at what the startups are doing. But I would say that some of the companies that they talk about who do these things, aside from, say, Coca-Cola, are companies that I hadn't heard of before in the context of larger chemical companies. So maybe some of these small companies are the ones that are moving on this stuff, finding this market, this niche, and hoping to bank on a lot of growth through some of this innovation.
John, you raised an interesting point that even, I mean, no matter what you make, at the end of the day, you still have to figure out the recycling component of it, right? And make that more efficient. And
yeah, I guess if you take one thing home from this, if you take one thing home from this conversation, I think you should say bioplastics are more than just one thing. Bioplastic is kind of an ambiguous term, but if you take home two ideas from this talk, it's the fact that the concept of all of the consumer goods that we have, it's an entire life cycle that we need to really understand about it. It's the generation, you know, when you make the material first, and then how you dispose of it. And ideally, if that disposal can then come back around and make the same thing, then it's circular. Maybe it comes back around and makes something a lower quality. Well, at least that's something, right? But this whole life cycle, whether it be this idealistic life cycle, right, or this more complex network of life cycles, that's really important, right? And there's so much innovation in all those areas.
I wonder if Greentown Labs has any group startups working inside that work on this topic. I don't know.
I do know there's one particular group in Greentown Labs that is working on a bio-based material that is going to be used to spray onto produce in order to seal the produce and have a much longer shelf life for transportation.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. I was walking through and bumped into someone and they introduced something new. So I don't know too much more about the material than just the one conversation I had during Greentown Labs, but it's actually pretty interesting.
Lucas has put in the chat some companies that are working on this.
Right.
Small companies working with bigger companies.
In the Netherlands, though, so it's not close here.
Greentown Labs. So Greentown Labs is a shared laboratory and prototyping space that's in Somerville. It's very close to Boss Lab. They rent out space and you can have your startup or company go in there and do things. They have a full laboratory that has biological and chemical capabilities. And if you have a startup in Somerville, I would definitely encourage. Their rates are really cheap and it's a pretty good environment. And once people feel like being around other people again, it's a really nice community.
Any other questions for John? Comments, questions, feelings?
I have a question. It's out of curiosity. I used to eat a salad every day for lunch out of a plastic bag, which I would throw out. I discovered a plastic bag is a great way to to store a salad and then eat it out. I invented it. So, but colleagues of mine thought this is really bad. I mean, I'm wasting so much plastic. So they donated silicone bags for multiple use to me. What is that? What is silicone versus plastic? I mean, it supposedly lasts longer, but how does that fit in? Out of curiosity.
I do not know exactly what the difference between silicone and other plastics or polymers are. I don't know. Anybody else? We have a much more experienced material scientist than I am on the call. Is she here?
I think that it has to do with the backbone. I'm not absolutely certain here, but that in your standard plastic, it's a carbon backbone that puts your, that holds your chains together. With silicone, it's going to be a silicone backbone. So I don't think it's not a very carbon based solution.
I quickly Googled it, and you're right. You're exactly right. It's silicone is electrically identical to carbon in some contexts, being sp3 hybridizable. And the silicone is basically is a like an organic polymer, but they just replace it with silicon instead of carbon. So yeah, pretty much that. So the backbone is silicone based on carbon. And I think that might explain some of the flexibility because of its chemical structure. You said you're going on the second orbital, you're out to the third shell, which maybe has a little bit more room, and maybe the bonds are more flexible, but at least they're longer. So that could explain why it has more flexibility and more rigidity. But as far as the rest of the material properties are concerned, I don't know.
Any more questions for John? I'd like to thank everyone for coming tonight and taking time out of your evening to join us. This is the start of an ongoing seminar series that we hope to bring at least once a month, if not twice a month. But thank you again for coming. John, thank you. I appreciate that, all the work that you put into this. And I have a new appreciation for the complexity of the situation. And now when people say bioplastics, instead of going, oh my God, that's fantastic, I have an understanding that there are some caveats depending on the type of bioplastic it is. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully we're in the middle of something great. So yeah, thank you everyone. Thank you for the great questions and the discussion and the conversation. And yeah, I would encourage you guys to go and learn more and innovate more and yeah. And if any of you guys want to give a talk on something you're super excited about, just contact us at Boss Lab. We'd love to hear what you care about.
Yeah. Thank you, John. And thank you for organizing this. It's very exciting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, John. We appreciate that. All your effort.
Thank you.
Thanks, you guys. Have a great night.
You too. Bye.